In 1932, Australia declared war, not on another nation, but on a most unexpected foe, the emu. Yes, you heard that right. The emus won. Picture the vast Australian outback, where flocks of emus march across the red earth, completely unaware that they are about to become the center of a bizarre military campaign. These birds, tall and swift, would soon outmaneuver the best efforts of the Australian army. Newspapers would later trumpet the outcome, with headlines that seemed too absurd to be true. The mighty emu, victorious over man. In the fields, emus stood tall and unbothered, their feathers ruffled by the wind as if daring anyone to challenge their reign. The story quickly became legend, immortalized in vintage newspapers and whispered about in pubs across the country. The emu, a flightless bird native to Australia, would soon prove itself a most formidable opponent, one that no one saw coming. And so, as military trucks rolled out and bicycles rattled along the dusty roads, the stage was set for one of history's most unlikely wars. Our story begins not with the emus, but with the men who would eventually become their adversaries, Australian soldiers, shaped by hardship and the vast, unforgiving land. These men, many of them veterans of the Great War, returned home to a country as wild and unpredictable as the battlefields they'd left behind. The scars of World War I lingered, both in memory and in the faces of those who survived, as they tried to rebuild their lives in rural Australia. Many settled in remote regions, lured by government promises and the hope of prosperity. Their new lives mapped out across the vast Australian continent. But the land was harsh. Emus, grazing in the fields, became both a symbol of the wild and a challenge to the farmers' survival. Families worked the land together, facing the daily struggle of farming in a place where nature always had the upper hand. The emus, with their chicks in tow, roamed freely, often wandering into the carefully tended yards and crops of the settlers. Meanwhile, the government sent military advisors to observe and assist, their presence a reminder of the ongoing struggle between man and nature. Emus, undeterred by fences or boundaries, continued to roam the fields, their numbers growing with each passing season. The land itself was relentless. Sandstorms swept across the plains, making life even more difficult for those trying to eke out a living. Scarcity was everywhere. The hands of the farmers, caked with dirt, told the story of endless toil and uncertain reward. Newspapers warned of crisis. Headlines blared about the mounting challenges facing rural communities and the threat posed by the emu invasion. In the fields, emus grazed undisturbed, their presence a daily frustration for the farmers who watched their crops disappear. The struggle between man and emu was set against a backdrop of scarcity and survival, as both species vied for a place in the unforgiving Australian landscape. And so, as the emus stood tall in the grass, the stage was set for a most unlikely war, one that would pit soldiers against birds in a battle for the outback. As the breeding season ends, emus begin their long journey across the sunlit fields, moving in search of food and water. Large flocks graze together, their tall forms dotting the landscape as they sweep through the countryside. The emus gather in open fields, their numbers growing as more join the migration, a living tide of feathers and legs. Some pause to rest in grassy clearings, standing alert and watchful, ever wary of danger. Curious and persistent, emus peer through fences, undeterred by the boundaries set by humans. From above, the vast farmlands stretch out, a patchwork of crops and fields now threatened by the approaching flocks. Old rusty fences mark the boundaries of farms, but these barriers do little to stop the determined emus. Emus stride confidently through the fields, their presence a daily challenge for the farmers who depend on these lands. The emu, Australia's largest native bird, stands tall and resilient, perfectly adapted to the harsh environment. In parks and open spaces, emus are a familiar sight, blending into the rhythm of rural life. But as the emus move closer to settlements, the tools of man, like the machine gun, hint at the conflict to come. The emus stare back, unafraid, as if challenging the farmers to defend their crops. With each passing day, the tension between bird and farmer grows, setting the stage for an extraordinary confrontation. Even official documents and reports begin to reflect the seriousness of the emu invasion, as the problem can no longer be ignored. With the decision made, the wheels of the military machine began to turn, old vehicles lined up, ready for a most unusual campaign. Soldiers gathered in the field, preparing themselves for a battle unlike any they had faced before. Ammunition was readied, bullets gleaming in the sun, destined for a most unexpected enemy. Cameras were brought out to document the operation, capturing the moment for history. Maps of Australia were unfurled as officers plotted their strategy against the advancing emus. In makeshift camps, soldiers discussed tactics, their faces lit by the glow of the campfire. Binoculars scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the feathered foe. Around a table, military men pored over plans, determined to outwit their avian adversaries. Meanwhile, the emus waited in the fields, blissfully unaware of the coming storm. Machine guns were mounted and tested, the soldiers bracing for the first encounter. And so, with weapons ready and nerves steeled, the 7th Heavy Battery marched out to meet their feathered opponents. The campaign had begun, the soldiers advancing, the emus on the move, and history about to be made. The first major engagement of the Emu War took place on the 2nd of November, as soldiers set up their machine guns and prepared for battle. Across the field, emus wandered unsuspectingly, their tall forms moving through the grass, oblivious to the military might assembled against them. The soldiers opened fire, rifles cracking in the open air, but the emus proved to be surprisingly swift and difficult targets. One emu, its head held high, seemed to taunt the men, dodging bullets with an almost uncanny sense of timing. The soldiers pressed on, aiming carefully and firing in bursts, but the emus scattered in all directions, making coordinated attacks nearly impossible. In the aftermath, a lone emu stood in the field, a symbol of the bird's resilience and the soldiers' growing frustration. Spent ammunition littered the ground, a silent testament to the sheer volume of firepower unleashed with little effect. Meanwhile, the emus gathered at a waterhole, calmly drinking as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The soldiers regrouped in the smoky forest, their determination undimmed, but their confidence beginning to waver. Another emu standing tall in the grass watched the proceedings with what could only be described as quiet amusement. As the battle raged on, emus continued to feed, seemingly unfazed by the chaos erupting around them. Exhausted, some soldiers slumped against trees, reflecting on the absurdity of their mission and the tenacity of their feathered foes. By day's end, the emus remained undefeated, standing proudly in the field as the sun set on the first, and certainly not the last skirmish of the Great Emu War. Major Meredith's reports to the Defense Ministry began to read less like military dispatches and more like the diary of a man besieged by birds. Each day brought new tales of frustration as the emus outwitted every tactic the soldiers tried, leaving the men feeling more like the hunted than the hunters. The emus, meanwhile, gathered near water sources, always alert and ready to scatter at the first sign of danger. Their uncanny ability to sense movement kept them just out of range, taunting the soldiers with their elusive presence. In the wild, the emus blended perfectly with their surroundings, making it nearly impossible for the troops to get close. Their natural camouflage and quick reflexes turned every encounter into a game of cat and mouse. The birds would appear in the open fields, only to vanish into the tall grass at the slightest disturbance. Soldiers watched in disbelief as entire flocks melted away, leaving nothing but footprints behind. Even in the harsh desert, the emus thrived. Their resilience and resourcefulness allowed them to survive where others could not, further frustrating the exhausted men sent to stop them. The emus grazed in lush green fields, seemingly unfazed by the military's efforts. Their numbers only seemed to grow, as if mocking the soldiers' every move. Reports and letters sent back to headquarters became increasingly desperate, the paper itself bearing the weight of the soldiers' mounting exasperation. In the fields, soldiers pressed on, determined to turn the tide. But the emus always seemed one step ahead, darting through the grass and evading every ambush. Exhaustion set in. Men slumped in trenches, their spirits worn down by the relentless feathered foe. The emus had become more than a nuisance, they were a force of nature. Armored trucks rolled across the desert, but even modern machinery was no match for the emu's speed and unpredictability. The soldiers' frustration grew with every failed attempt. Some emus found themselves trapped behind fences, but most simply leapt or ran around obstacles, leaving the military baffled by their ingenuity. Newspapers began to pick up the story, reporting on the ongoing struggle. The public watched with a mix of amusement and disbelief as the mighty Australian army was humbled by a flock of birds. In the midst of it all, the emus continued their daily routines, undisturbed by the chaos they had caused, as if the war was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Letters home were filled with tales of defeat and disbelief, as soldiers tried to explain how a simple bird had outsmarted an entire military campaign. The campaign ended not with a triumphant victory, but with a quiet, humbling retreat. The soldiers, outmatched by their feathered foes, withdrew from the fields, leaving the emus to reclaim their territory. The emus, undisturbed and unbothered, continued to roam the land as if nothing had happened, their dominance over the outback unchallenged. Reports of the withdrawal spread quickly, and the story of the military's defeat at the hands, or rather, the feet, of the emus became the talk of the nation. Emus could be seen crossing roads and fields with newfound confidence, as if celebrating their unlikely victory over the might of modern weaponry. In the aftermath, the emus thrived, grazing peacefully while the military licked its wounds, and the world looked on in disbelief and amusement. As the sun set on the so-called Great Emu War, the only clear victors were the birds themselves, silhouetted against the fading light. A reminder that sometimes nature has the last laugh. News of the Great Emu War quickly spread around the world, with headlines capturing the absurdity of an army bested by birds. Images of emus grazing in the Australian fields became symbols of the birds' unlikely victory, shared and chuckled over in distant lands. The story inspired jokes, cartoons, and even mock wanted posters, as the world found humor in Australia's feathery foes. Yet behind the laughter, the emu, standing tall and unbothered, reminded everyone of nature's resilience and unpredictability. In classrooms and cafes, people laughed at the tale, but also reflected on the challenges of living alongside Australia's wild creatures. The emu, often seen behind fences or in the open, became a lasting symbol of the country's unique wildlife and the lessons learned from the war. In the end, the Emu War left a legacy of humility, humor, and respect for the natural world, a story retold for generations. Today, the Great Emu War of 1932 is remembered with a wry smile, a tale so strange it could be mistaken for a headline about UFOs invading Earth. Friends gather and laugh, sharing the story of how a modern army was outwitted by a flock of determined birds. Emus still roam the golden fields of Australia, their victory a living legend running across the land. The story sits on the shelf of history, a curious chapter that continues to fascinate and amuse. Emus stroll through their natural habitat, blissfully unaware of their place in military lore. The vast outback remains their domain, a reminder that sometimes nature has the last laugh. Peeking over fences, the emu seems to say, "Remember us?" A gentle nudge to never underestimate the unexpected. Standing tall on the open plain, the emu is both a symbol of resilience and a punchline to one of history's most unusual wars. With a keen gaze, the emu surveys its kingdom, victorious, unbothered, and forever part of Australia's story.